This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Deracheha and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. This entire podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael. All of these episodes draw on the rich sources and discussions of Women&Mitzvot on Deracheha.org. This conversation touches on halachic aspects of counting the Omer, as well as meaningful ideas behind the mitzvah. Hi, Shana.
Hi, Yosefa.
Our topic today is Sefirat Ha-omer. Sefirat Ha-omer is the mitzvah to count the days and the weeks, 49 days, 7 weeks, from Pesach until Shavuot. We call it counting the Omer, counting the sheaf, because we begin it on the second night of Pesach, which is the halachic day when the barley offering, the Omer, was brought in the Beit HaMikdash. So really, it's counting from the Omer, not counting of the Omer. And it's important for me, at least, to emphasize that this was originally really a happy and uplifting time of the year, a time when we remembered our redemption from Egypt and then counted with anticipation towards Shavuot. We're looking forward to Matan Torah. And Shavuot is really the essence and the culmination of our exodus from Mitzrayim, because there we get the Torah and we enter into the covenant with Hashem, which was the whole point of leaving Mitzrayim to begin with.
Yes. And it's so important, I think, to specifically draw attention to the fact that this was a very happy and uplifting time, because when I hear the words Sefirat Ha-omer, or Sefira, as people like to call it, I don't think I'm alone in the fact that it immediately has some negative associations. And that's because we know that later on in history, Sefirat Ha-omer, this period, became also associated with practices of mourning that we observe in memory of the loss of the 24,000 Talmidim, the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva, who died during these weeks in the years following the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. And we'll talk about them, and we'll talk about the impact that had on us. But that is not at all what Sefirat Ha-omer, in the Torah, was originally meant to be about. So the time of year, therefore, that we're going to be talking about now is a time that really has a lot of different layers and a lot of different aspects to it. At its core, it's about this count of these days from Pesach to Shavuot. And we know that when we're excited about something, we often do. We often do count the days until it happens. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim even talks about how it's like someone who's waiting, with anticipation, faithfully to see someone they love. It's that excited feeling of counting the days. And today, I would say, when we think about Sefirat Ha-omer, we mostly tap into the part of the count that's connected, as you said, to the Chagim, to the festivals. That's connected to the fact that there's this count that's going on between Pesach and Shavuot that's linking the two holidays, because the holidays are things that are still relevant to us. All of us around the world, no matter where Jews live, are still keeping the holidays of Pesach and Shavuot, and they're counting the Omer. But it's important to note that there were also two other significant elements that are associated with this count that are mentioned in the Psukim. There's an element that has to do with the sacrifices, with the karbanot, and there's also an element that has to do with the agriculture of this time. So when it comes to the sacrifices, we see in Vayikra, when we're talking about Sefirat Ha-omer, there's specific mention of the karbanot that were brought in the Mikdash during this time. So in Vayikra, in Parak Chav Gimel, in the 23rd Parak, it says, Usafartam nacham mimacharad hashabbat, miyom haviachem et omer hatshnufa. That count for yourself, this count, right, from the day after the Shabbat, which here is talking about the day after the first day of Pesach. And from the day that you're going to bring the Omer, meaning that you're going to bring this barley offering, and then you're going to count 50 days until when? Until the day that you offer a new grain offering to God. So the count is framed not just by the holidays, but by the karbanot that were brought. And we know that the karbanot that were brought were these two different karbanot of, on the one hand, on Pesach was this offering of barley. And then on Shavuot, we have this new grain offering, which is an offering of 2 loaves of bread that were made from wheat. So I think, about the fact that today, when we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, we don't feel as we don't feel connected to the karbanot. It's not something that resonates for us. We're not able to like kind of tap into the meaning of what that meant. But for the Jewish people who were living in the time of the Mikdash, they understood the difference between a karban from barley and a karban from wheat. And that was something that carried a lot of meaning and a lot of significance. So while we're focused on the like Pesach Shavuot element, there are other elements of this count that I think are at least important to mention.
Yeah, and I think also important to mention is that underlying the differences in korbanot is an agricultural piece, which is slightly less far from us.
Right.
Again, we have in many parts of the world have elements of agriculture, different produce and products that are available to us all throughout the year. So sometimes we lose touch with that. But you've already touched upon the fact that there's a very big switch that happens between Pesach and Shavuot, and that we have the barley crop is the piece that we're bringing in Pesach time, and that shifts when we're able to bring a wheat offering around Shavuot. That also is said explicitly in the Torah,
Mm-hmm.
in the book of Dvarim in Perek Tet Zayin, and it says Shiv'a Shavuot tispor lecha mehechel chermesh bakama tachel lispor Shiva Shavuot. That 7 weeks you count for yourself from when the sickle is first upon the standing grain. You have to count for 7 weeks. And then you will observe the festival of Shavuot. And this will also, Asher titen ka'asher yivachecha Hashem Elokecha. And all of this represents like this bounty and this blessing that Hashem gives us. And so while we're talking about the korbanot that will bring the mikdash, at the root of it is what agriculture or what produce is available at that time. And that's a shift that I think is meaningful, or we can sort of take a lesson from, no matter whether we're living in a world of the Beit Mikdash or not.
Right.
Because the shift from barley, which sort of historically was considered to be a lower grain. And that is mostly because it was used for animals. With a little bit of scientific research, I discovered also that the ability to separate the parts that we want to eat from the parts we don't want to eat in the barley is a harder process. And therefore, it was easier to give that kind of grain to an animal as opposed to wheat, which has always been something that's easier to process, right? So today we have highly processed wheats or things like that when we get to white grains. But those are two different kinds of processes. And so the barley was considered to be like a lower kind of grain, which I think is significant.
Less refined.
Yeah, less refined. And it's significant because that represents, it's very much aligned with where we were Pesach time, right? We were a less refined people. We were coming out of Egypt. We were, if we take the language of Chazal, in Mem Tet Sharei Tuma, we were kind of like in our lowest level of purification. And as we go through these 7 weeks and count this time, we become a little bit more like the refined wheat, right? We become better versions of ourselves. We become better able to enter into a partnership with God. And so that is a very deep connection, both between the agricultural side and I would say the Chagim side, even in the absence of the Korban piece.
Because agriculturally, the barley ripened weeks before the wheat did. So, right, that's not something that we're necessarily accustomed to thinking about when we go out and we buy our bread or our flour in the store. But for people that lived in an agricultural society and were farmers, so they very much understood the significance also of that move from the barley to the wheat because they felt it. They went out to their fields and they saw it.
Yeah. And the other piece that's significant halachically, and it's in addition, I would say a Torah addition to the piece about agriculture, is the fact that the Omer offering becomes the matir, becomes the allowance to then participate or utilize the new wheat, what's called the chadash, the new wheat crop of that year. And so that's sort of the halachic or the Torah layer to this whole thing, meaning it's not just that we've shifted in what blossoms or what is now produced, but this korban enables us to then utilize the wheat that happens. And it's interesting because when I think about this shift, I often think about Tu B'Shvat, because Tu B'Shvat, we celebrate all these fruits, but what do we eat? Dried fruits, because those fruits are most of them not ripe yet, right? So we take the dried versions that probably were picked a year ago. And that's very similar here, meaning we celebrate the beginning of a wheat crop that isn't really ready yet. I mean, that's really going to be ready by Shavuot. That's, of course, Megillat Ruth, etc. And so a lot of times I really think about this korban as being like Tu B'Shvat. We're going to celebrate it because this is the saplings, right? It's just the beginning. And so we're already thanking Hashem for the fact that the process is beginning and the world is shifting, even though the actual produce of that or the end result is not yet really in our hands.
It's a beautiful point that even if we're not fully there yet, we could already thank Hashem. We could already begin to see the potential of what's going to be and be grateful for that. I will say that I do feel a shift in myself living in Israel that I am a little more aware of the agricultural calendar than I was.
Having my strawberries now, I'm very excited.
Yeah, exactly. Because like the fruits here are very seasonal. And when the fruit isn't in season, it's sometimes really hard to find it, or you could find it, but it's much, much more expensive, which is very different than the supermarkets that I grew up in, where like basically all year you were able to get everything. Because in the United States, they were drawing from markets around the world. And it's somewhere, it's
Somewhere in
somewhere.
Mexico, they were still making star fruit on January.
Exactly. And also, like, we live in a home that when we bought it, we were delighted to find out that there's several fruit trees in the backyard. So we have all different kinds. We have 5 different fruit trees. And I noticed that the apples and the pomegranates, the rimonim, like they ripen right around Rosh Hashanah time. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's why those fruits became largely associated, with this holiday. It's not like that they chose what was available and they found meaning in that. And it makes me realize that, the farmers again of the time of the Mikdash, I think really, really, really also felt that way about the barley and the wheat. And it also connects to the fact that Rabbi Akiva in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah even suggests that in addition to the Omer sacrifice being offered on Pesach as a way, as you said, of making the new grain permissible, it also was brought kind of almost like as a tefillah, as a hope of causing blessing to be brought. Like, yes, on the one hand, as a way of thanking Hashem, as you said, but also as like a hope, that this karban will also signify the blessing that we hope will apply to the new grain crop. And I think, just taking a moment to think about these things as we maybe, make our challah or prepare, our different foods or whatever, and could help us also connect and really understand some of these other elements of the count of Sefirat Ha-omer that are not always forefront in our minds.
Yeah, I think in general, whenever we connect more to the agricultural elements of the world, they're much more related to our daily life than we often realize. Meaning you're mentioning just in the, oh, well, this is why we have that fruit for that holiday, which is also important. But there are so many elements about the way that the natural world functions that we've kind of lost touch with that deeply impact our mood, how we behave. Like there's so many layers there that I think are really important, and it's moving when we're able to discover them. I actually just wanted to focus for a minute, Shayna, on the actual act of counting, which I think is an interesting it's a prominent element of this time period. You mentioned earlier this piece about the Rambam about waiting to see someone we love, right? That we count up in this time period, which is a unique element of the count, right? Usually we count down to things, or when you were talking about counting before, I was thinking about this whole, I have no idea if this is a phenomenon in the States as well, but the countdown to like weddings, and then you hold up a sign with the number. Yeah, lots to say about that phenomenon. Okay. But anyways, we usually count down. So here we famously count up. And that immediately brings to mind 2 other halachic counts or Torah counts that we have that I think it's interesting taking a moment to think about which of those is the Omer actually more parallel.
So other counts where we're counting up.
Exactly. We're counting up to them. Yeah. So the first is the one that's also agricultural, which is the Shemitah and Yovel cycle, right? So the Shemitah is we're counting up to the 7th year, and that's a sabbatical year. And then the Yovel is going to be 7 cycles of that Shemitah cycle. And there we also count up. And that count is often considered to be a count that's associated with Kedusha, right? When we talk about Kedushat Haaretz, that we're getting to this year, we're going to have an elevated level of Kedusha. And so that's a count up to get toward that space. And I would also say that in that kind of count, we're not necessarily looking to get past something. I would even say the Shemitah year has certain challenges to it. So we're not necessarily looking to race to get to the Shemitah year, even though in an ideal sense, there's a lot of elements to the year that are very, very special. But we're counting up in a way that I would say is paced and is patient to a certain degree. And when we fall upon that particular year, then we enter into that world with all the stipulations that it requires.
We didn't say we're counting up, but not, as you said, to like necessarily get somewhere as much as to recognize like each year has its specific significance. So in the different masers that are brought, exactly on what year we're in. So like it's a count that's noting, oh, we're in year 2, we're in year 5.
It's almost like a counting of presence. You know what I'm saying? It's a counting of being present in that particular year.
This is where we are. Let's note the point, at which we find ourselves.
Exactly. And the other count that is familiar to everyone is the count of tahara, of purification, right? We have the concept of A zava, a woman who has non-menstrual bleeding for 3 days or more, has to count 7 clean days. Now, that's a halacha that's familiar to all women because in the way the halacha developed, all women, even when it's menstrual bleeding, are also counting those seven clean days. And this also is a count up, and you count from 1 to day 7, and then a woman can go and immerse in the mikvah. And I would say this, safe to say that I think often we're happy to move past the count, right? We're in anticipation to get to the end of the 7th day. And so we're in anticipation of completing that. Now, this idea, the Zohar brings us up about the comparison. Now, let's bring this back to the Omer and see where this brings us, right? It already compares this Zava count to the Omer. And I'll just read a few lines. It's in the Zohar Parshat Emor. כמו האישה שכאשר פסקו ממנה דמים של טומאה, לאחר שפסקו ממנה מה כתוב, וספרה לה 7 ימים. Okay, so it says just like a woman who, after she's finished bleeding, has to count for 7 days. What did it say? And she should count for herself 7 clean days. כך כאן, כיוון שנכנסו ישראל בברית עם השם, פסקה מהם טומאתם, ואמר הקדוש ברוך הוא, מכאן ואילך ספרו לטהרה. So here we have the parallel being made that what's the comparison? We're about to enter into a marriage with God, right? We're about to be reunited with God at Har Sinai. And so just like the woman in anticipation of the couple reconnecting, so too here we're going to be counting up in anticipation of connecting with God.
It also connects back to what you said about the purification process, that if Bnei Israel were on a lower level of tahara when they came out of Mitzrayim, they had to go through a process to become ready and pure enough to receive the Torah, which is in essence like that process of Shiva Nikim. You're counting those 7 days to become tahara at the end of it.
Yeah. And if I just sort of bring this back to the specific Omer piece, I think we really see that there is a connection to both, right? We both have, as you said, a connection to the Zava, of that counting up for a purification process, which connects more to the historical piece of Matan Torah.
Mm-hmm.
It almost feels like in elongation of the Shloshet Yemei Hagbala by Har Sinai, where we know that in those 3 days of preparation that men and women separated from each other in order to be able to receive the Torah. It a little bit feels like elongating that idea, but it clearly also echoes the agricultural cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
We just said that the agricultural piece is a very significant layer of this time period. And so it both seems to be accounting up for Kedusha and maybe accounting up L'Tahara, depending on which layer of this time period we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. And I also appreciate that sometimes when we're counting, as you said, like sometimes we're counting towards an end goal, like we just want to get towards the end. And sometimes we are counting so that we actually pay more attention to the process. And for me, I'll say by nature, I think people who know me, they don't even have to know me so well to know this about me. I'm the kind of person who likes to get to the end, like if you would do some kind of personality assessment on me, I'm like the person who likes to get things done and check things off and, complete processes and have closure. And it's harder for me to be in the process. But as I have gotten older, and honestly, life has gotten more complicated, and you can't just knock things off like that because they take time and because you have to give things the attention that they deserve. I've had to learn to be more in the process. And there's something here about the Sefirat Ha-omer that has both elements, as you're saying. Meaning, on the one hand, we are counting to get towards an end and we want to get there and we want to receive the Torah. And that's the big goal in mind. And that's great. And on the other hand, to just be present in the process itself of Sefirat Ha-omer is also, I think, something special. And I'm wondering if it would be even a good idea, and I'm thinking about this now for myself, to choose maybe a very specific, concrete process that we ourselves could work on during these weeks. A process that's not just about getting to the end, but maybe a mitzvah, a character trait of ours that we want to give more attention to, or a friendship that we want to work on or invest in, or a sefer that we want to learn, not so that we can make a siyam and say we finished it, but because we actually want to give time to and appreciate the material that's in that book. I think that there is something about appreciating the actual time period that we're in and this idea of growing and working towards something, but also very much being in that thing at the same time. So I love that the 2 counts that you brought in, each one of them, I think, connects to a different aspect of that.
Totally. And I think the idea about process, or in my mind, that goes to gestation. There's an idea.
Real process.
Yes. There's another, I think, really prominent idea that I think is worth mentioning, which is that The exodus from Egypt is actually pretty unsettledly framed as a birth in many elements of the story. We first, of course, the whole story begins with the birth of Moshe. That's the second chapter in Shemot. First we have all the threats, but the salvation itself starts really in chapter 2, where Moshe is born, and we have there the whole drama of his birth and saving him, and we also have the fact that the entire Egypt story is really pushed forward by the fecundity and the fact that the women of the Israelite women of Egypt were able to have so many children
Mhm.
despite the fact that they were being oppressed. But it's not just a physical birth of children that really is the strong point here. There are multiple elements. If you've never thought about it, it's kind of freaky when you first discover it, but I can't unsee it now. That there are many elements of the story itself of women leaving Egypt that are really explicitly framed as a birth. The blood on the doorpost is a big one. This is also, by the way, not my ideas. I'll quote Alana Pardes, who's a scholar of literature, actually, but I'm sure it exists also in Midrashim that I probably just haven't met yet. And so we have there sort of the idea of the fact that something is being birthed, and that the first part of it has sort of that opening piece at the entrance, and we have the Exodus itself going through the Yam Suf, which is going through, all of Am Yisrael going through wet waters onto dry land and coming out on the other side and coming out alive through an experience that is pretty harrowing and through something that's quite narrow. Like, that is a very, very overt element of this kind of image. And why is that significant? Oh, in addition, also, it takes place at night, in the middle of the night. It's also not just a myth, if anyone here has gone into labor at night or anything like that, but the vast majority of labors, I believe, start at night. It has to do a lot with hormonal processes in the body. Also, women are more relaxed at night, so it enables that process to begin. And I think that this is really important because it really bespeaks this idea that we were birthed in Egypt, essentially, meaning Moshe is born, sure, and the children are born, but as a nation, we're sort of like pushed out of that in, I would say, not necessarily so elegantly, but we're like pushed out of that space. But then we have to undergo a process when we come out kind of squishy and wet and have to be cleaned up. And that whole process is what's happening in the 7 weeks we have now, is that you're saying, adopting a midah, we're going through a process now. And, immediately after we literally get onto dry land, the first thing that happens right after in that parak is that we start crying for food and water, meaning Am Yisrael in the desert are really quite overtly depicted also as, initially maybe young children, maybe after that teenagers, until we get to a much more mature place. So I think that piece is also significant for me. I think about it often in terms of the process, in terms of the way that we sort of get a head start, the fact that women are the most significant in that early part of the story, which is simply a biological truth of what we do in this world. And so that to me is also a very significant piece, but it really bespeaks this idea of the process we go through right now in this time period, that this is where we need to refine, whether it's to refine ourselves like wheat, if that metaphor speaks to us, to refine ourselves in our character to be worthy of receiving the Torah and Shavuot.
I love that idea. I was not familiar with it. And there's something also just very real and true in the sense that birth is not simple. There's birth pangs. Like there's a process that is not comfortable, and at the end, like, we're still so happy with the results, but it's something that causes us discomfort. We have to go through something that's not simple. And I think that's also that process of Bnei Israel being formed as a nation, coming out of Mitzrayim, breaking out of a slave mentality, finding ourselves, understanding what our identity is something that was not easy either, and continues also, like, for us as a people, to be something that I think is not always easy to contend with. And the metaphor that you just brought, I think, gives a lot of framing to that. I think, if we come back also to the different explanations that we've been speaking about behind the meaning of Sefirat Ha-omer, so whether it's the the festivals and the connection between Pesach and Shavuot, it's the karbanot, it's the agricultural element, it's interesting to note how those different explanations then have a direct impact on how we view the obligation of counting the Omer, because there are those like the Rambam who think that the festive element is what's core here. Like, that's what's central to the count, and that the main reason that we are counting is because we're counting towards Matan Torah, and we're counting leading up to Shavuot. And therefore he holds that, of course, the mitzvah of counting Sefirat HaOmer, even today, when there's no Beit HaMikdash and there's no karbanot, is still going to be deoraita, because it's about the festivals, and the festivals are very much still part of our lives today. But there's other authorities who hold that because we're no longer able to bring the karbanot, episode of the Omer, and we're no longer able to bring the shtei halechem, the 2 loaves of bread, on Shavuot, so the whole count is now rabbinic. It's only d'Rabbanan. So it's interesting always how like the mashma'ud and the meaning behind things also then impact the way that we think about the obligation. And then when it comes to a woman's obligation, in terms of Sefirat Ha-omer, so there are early opinions that hold that, contrary to what most others think, that they believe that it's actually not a time-bound mitzvah, that counting the Omer is not a mitzvah to say shazman grama, because they say the counting is more directly bound to the sacrifices, and it's more directly bound to the mikdash, and it's not really about a time. Or perhaps there's also people that say that the concept of a time-bound mitzvah doesn't apply to a mitzvah that is itself about time. So these authorities say that, therefore, if the mitzvah is not a time-bound mitzvah, then women would be obligated in it exactly the same way that men are. In practice, though, and I think, we understand this, most authorities believe that because the count has to take place during a specific season, during a specific time of year, they do consider Sefirat Ha-omer to be a mitzvah d'aseh shazman grama, a time-bound mitzvah, and therefore most authorities hold that women are p'turot, that women are exempt. And the Mishnah Brura even goes, to the place where he writes that it seems that in our land, women are not at all accustomed to count. Like he writes, not just that they're the p'turot, but like this is something that they never really even, took on, or that many, many women, at least when the Mishnah Brura is writing, were not engaged in this mitzvah.
Just one piece about the mitzvah d'aseh shazman grama element here. Sometimes I feel like if it's for 49 days straight, I don't know if we could still call it something that's time-bound. Like I feel like the definition has to expire at some point when it's so many days in a row. I'll just add one other piece, which is about the bracha piece, right? So famously, we make a bracha every time we count, which also is part of the idea that perhaps each day itself is its own mitzvah. And we've already said in other episodes that Sephardi poskim are much more machmir on this whole topic of women making brachot when she's exempt from the mitzvah. And so in this case where we have, again, a bracha each day, that would possibly cause an issue. And the Ashkenazi poskim...
Meaning she could still count, but
yes,
they would hold just like
without a bracha.
So that she can't make the bracha because she's doing it voluntarily.
Totally. And so the Ashkenazi poskim, they often, again, come to the conclusion that even if a woman is exempt, when she opts in, she's able to say the bracha. Because when we say Asher Kisham Tzivanu, we're not speaking specifically about me per se that maybe is exempt from the mitzvah, but we're talking about Am Yisrael Kulo.
Right. We were commanded.
The general collective commandment. And so therefore they're not as stringent about this idea of saying brachot and whether a person has their specific obligation or not. Historically, I'll just say that there were definitely many communities of women that were really careful to count Sefirat Ha-omer with a bracha. And for them, it might have really been considered a binding custom, meaning similar to the way that there were kilot that accepted upon themselves, the women accepted upon themselves hearing shofar, and that becomes a mitzvah that even though it's a mitzvah d'aseh shazman grama, it's considered binding for women, that in many communities it's very possible that that would have the same status here in the mitzvah of counting the Omer.
Yeah, so we see that there were really different practices amongst women. And part of the reason that it could be that there were women who never opted into this is because there's a passage in the Zohar that states that the days of the Omer are somehow mystically connected to the masculine realm. I don't really understand those Kabbalistic things, so I'm not going to comment more on that. But according to the Zohar, because he thinks the Omer is connected to the masculine realm, it could be that the mitzvah to count, therefore, is unique to men. And some poskim therefore take this to mean that women can't count the Omer. Like they can't even count voluntarily and even without a bracha, so which is really interesting. So that's one, I think, factor that influenced maybe less women counting. And another is that there are Ashkenazim poskim who are concerned about women reciting a bracha, even if they're going to count voluntarily. They're concerned that maybe they shouldn't say the bracha because they worry that maybe if a woman ends up missing a day, she won't realize that now she's no longer allowed to make a bracha, even if she continues counting, and then she could end up like
saying 37 days,
exactly, of making brachot in vain and saying God's name in vain. So they tell her not to count to begin with. Many other poskim, and I do want to emphasize this, do permit women though to count the Omer and to count with the bracha, and they don't raise this concern at all. And these authorities studies such as the Aruch HaShulchan consider women counting the Omer no different than women doing any other positive town bonds mitzvah, like shaking a lulav or other things, which they think are wonderful things to women to do if they can, even if they're officially exempt. So when it comes to the fact that there are communities of Ashkenazi women who don't count Omer at all and they don't even attempt to do it, it could be that just the fact that there were those authorities who were concerned about, like, what if they forgot the bracha and then they end up making. So even though many others don't hold like that, it could still be that just that like concern that was put out there in the world already had an influence and kind of like gave this scary feeling to women of like, don't even start, don't even bother because you don't want to come to end up saying brachot levatala. I think, and I mean, I guess this isn't surprising, we've spoken about this often, that I think it's nice that there are so many women of our generation, including of our mother's generation and grandmother's generation, who have now started to take on this mitzvah, even if it's not something that they grew up with. I personally know women who later on in life decided that, like, no, I also want to count. I also want to actually count. And whether they started on their own or they began doing it alongside a husband or with their children, what they discovered is that there's something that can be very meaningful and fulfilling to be part of a national count, because basically you are tapping into like a national experience. You're participating along with the rest of the nation in this feeling of like we are anticipating something. We are waiting for something. We are working up to something. And therefore, I think, this idea of counting could be very, very significant. And even if there's someone who follows the opinions that say that you shouldn't make a bracha, whether it's a Sephardi woman or whether it's, the Ashkenazi poskim who say like that still doesn't mean that you can't actually count the day and that you can't note the day and you can't know, like, hey, where are we? We're up to day 36, so there's X amount of time left. I think, that's something that all women could be a part of, whether or not they're going to do the actual specific act of saying the bracha.
I want to share a spontaneous thought I just had right now as you were saying that, which is that there, I'm thinking about that Zohar, about this idea of the masculine. Women are naturally always an account. And I think that the idea that a count that's external to a person is a masculine makes a lot of sense in like the broader philosophical way. And I think
Meaning they're attuned to their bodies and to their monthly cycle, and they're somewhere always in some kind of count. And therefore, that idea of an external count
is almost something that might have thought is not even necessary, meaning it's external to them. Hold on, that's not at all what I think halachically at all. But I'm just thinking about that as you were saying that. There's a lot of things to unpack that, but we'll leave that for maybe for a different conversation. But I'll just want to be a consistent record, if not a broken record, which is that I think that it's great to opt into something that's so simple. Like, I don't see a reason to opt out. Do you know what I'm saying? This is it's sort of like low-hanging fruit, this mitzvah. It's really easy. It takes very little time. And as you said, it makes you part of the national movement of what's going on in Am Yisrael right now. Like, to me, that's a win-win. I would say that if someone, was following the tradition of their family, which is that women never counted, and they feel that connects them to Masorah, so, okay, that's something I understand. But other than that, I think that very often, and I've mentioned this before, and I'll probably keep mentioning it, the idea that there are those who talk about giving women exemptions creates an exemption mindset, which is a mindset of like, all right, like, I don't have to do that, so I'm not going to do it. And to me,
soft bigotry of low expectations.
exactly, like, just take a seat at the table, and I'll say something else here, which is, I think part of what happens is that Sefirat Omer for men is counted usually at Mariv, meaning you say it after you daven Mariv. So I would say, instead of saying, oh, well, it's hard to remember, I'll be like, it's a great time to take upon yourself davening Mariv. I'm saying that truly.
Poskim that we're concerned that women are going to forget, we're probably concerned because many, many women traditionally didn't daven Mariv.
And that's true. They didn't.
We had to flip it and say, so at least for these weeks, daven Mariv, and then maybe
daven Mariv, you don't forget. It's right there in the next page at the end. You know what I'm saying? Meaning it's a natural part of Mariv. And yes, there are many reminder systems, and you can put a reminder on your phone, and there's all these online movements, and there's a million really sweet ways that people are reminding themselves now to count the Omer. But I would even just say traditionally, like, yeah, you could just daven Mariv and say Sefirat Omer at the end. I know that that's definitely my best way to not forget. And I will say that there were years where I literally was out on like day 2 or 3. Like that happened to me. Okay, and there's
In
different.
Israel, sadly, you could get out on day one because, like, growing up in America, that first night of counting the Omer was at the end of the Haggadah of the second Seder, So, like, you finish the second Seder, and it's like, if you hadn't said the Omer in shul, it's like a reminder for the women who maybe weren't, at Mariv to, but if you don't have a second Seder and it's Motzei Chag here, and the men maybe who are in shul davened, and there's a woman who's at home, or maybe doesn't usually daven Mariv or whatever, or does daven Mariv, but she isn't in that
Not in
time
the,
space.
not
So,
remembering
like,
it.
all of a sudden, the first day, you could
It happened to me.
So,
It
like,
happened to me.
in Israel, even more so, I think we really need to, like, put in place whatever reminder system you're gonna use to, like, have that going already, the second night, which is Motzei Chag here.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I just think like it's just a good opportunity to like count in, make ourselves count, be part of the count. Like I think it's a good opportunity.
And as you said, today there's all different kinds of cute little reminders. So there's people that have magnets on their front doors. They can't walk into the house without seeing it. There's people that have magnets on their fridge. I saw all these advertisements for these pillowcases. I don't own one of these, but it's pretty cute. It's like, I saw one that says, don't count sheep, count Omer before you go to sleep. And on the pillow is like the whole count, and it comes with the washable marker, and you check it off or whatever. So whatever it takes to get into the swing of things is good. And in general, for me, like, just the fact that we're sitting here and we're talking about this, I think is really helpful to, like, help put me in that mindset, in that headspace of like, right, this is a happy time. This is a time that we are supposed to feel excited, because coming back to what we said at the beginning, unfortunately, we know that at a certain point in history, that unmitigated joy that really like defines these weeks became somewhat overshadowed, or maybe you want to say diluted, by the practices of mourning that we observe in memory of these 12,000 pairs of Talmidim, these 24,000 students who all tragically died in these weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, the students of Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because the Gemara says, Lo nahagu kavod ze lezeh, that they didn't treat each other with respect. Now, on the one hand, the fact that they died specifically during these weeks doesn't really seem to be connected to the historical time period of Sefirat Ha-omer. It's just when they died, and it happens to overlap with, what we know as Sefirat Ha-omer. On the other hand, the Maharal actually notes that, like, it just can't be that if people have underlying, like, real character flaws, that they woke up on, Pesach morning and, like, all of a sudden started not treating each other with respect. It has to be that, like, there is some kind of significance to why they died specifically during these weeks and not at any other point during the year. And he says that it's fair to assume that, like, it was something that was going on before this time. And he answers that we know that when Bnei Israel accepted the Torah at Har Sinai, there was a very unique and intense kind of unity that they experienced as a nation. The pasuk in Parshat Yitro that describes Bnei Israel arriving in the Sinai desert starts off in plural. It says, Vayavohu midbar Sinai, v'yachanu midbar, that they came as a group. They came as a, nation to the desert, and they encamped there. But then suddenly it switches to the singular, and it says, Vayichan sham Yisrael, like as if it's talking about an individual. And it says, like, he encamped there, neged Hahar, before this nation. And Rashi and others, see that switch, and they note it. And Rashi comments, why all of a sudden is it talking in singular? And he says, Ki ish echad belev echad, because the nation really was like one person with one heart, meaning they were so unified in their excitement and in their desire to accept the Torah. And the Maharal learns from this that actually unity is therefore an essential and an integral part of what it means to live a Torah lifestyle, and that the Torah can't survive if it's not taught, or it's not learned, or it's not observed in an environment of ki'ish echad b'lev echad, in an environment of respect. Now, respect doesn't mean that we all have to think exactly the same, and respect doesn't mean that we can't have disagreements. We know that our tradition is full of machloket and full of people who saw things differently and had different approaches, but it means that we have to look at each other and at least have a basic respect for the other person and the way that they approach life and the way that they carry themselves. And the Maharal says, if you had these Talmidei Chachamim, this group of Talmidim, like the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, this really major Tana, and they were learning all this Torah, but they weren't able to treat each other with respect, then there was something pagum, like there was something tainted, there was something not okay in their Torah itself. And therefore, he says the punishment happened specifically during these weeks of Sefirat Ha-omer, which honestly is not simple to read because we're in a complex time here in Israel and I think around the world in terms of our internal rifts. Like at the beginning of the war, there was a feeling of like, oh, all the strife and all the,
Yeah, I was
all
gonna say, Yafi, that those kind of feelings they can't last for that
all
long.
that lack of unity that we felt in 2023 with the judicial reform here in Israel, like, puff, it all went away at the beginning of the war. And as you said, it doesn't last. And sadly, those things come back. And again, it's not that people can't disagree, but it's like the bad feeling and it's the hatred and it's the pain and it's the tension that you see like between Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora, between Jews of different denominations. So in short, this idea of Jews not treating each other with respect is not something that applies to like, ugh, those students of Rabbi Akiva, and they messed it up for all of us now. In 2026, we have to observe these practices of mourning because they didn't know how to treat each other. It's like, no, his parish is like a motivator for us to be like, we too, unfortunately, suffer from this idea of lo nahagu kavod zeh lezeh. We also have to think about how we are relating to other people. Do we see them as our brothers and sisters? And perhaps when we observe the mourning practices of this time period, instead of just looking at them as, like things that are annoying or things that like why do we have to be bothered with this, we could actually stop for a minute and take them as an opportunity to maybe ourselves think about how to approach the people around us differently and with more kavod.
I actually just wanted to share a personal example I was thinking about as you described that Maharal, because I guess I had a little bit of avodat hamidot opportunity before the Omer period because we're recording this a little bit before, and I, like happens to many of us, I just like wasn't in such a good place, like vis-a-vis my kids. I was very stressed out about an event that never happened because there was a war and then it didn't happen. And I just was stressed. And, sometimes our stress comes out in all different pores of ours in different spaces that it doesn't belong. And I just like wasn't in my nicest period of time. And then, another war broke out that we're in still currently right now. And I was like, and then my husband went off to Miluim and I was like, okay, Yosefa, you got to get this under control. Like you have to, and it was mamash like that element of kavod. Like I have to be like the best version of myself right now. And like, no one
So
wants,
our kids deserve respects.
oh, and they told me that, meaning they didn't want a yelly ima. And I totally get that. I was in a yelly place. And this doesn't help so much for Avodat Hamidot because I can't exactly tell you what I did, but I had like this internal switch and I was just like, no more. And I just like somehow was like, find those inner reservoirs of patience and like tap into them, Yosefa. And I have to tell you, I'm gonna say this, like I was a little bit moved like by my own ability to like be a better version of myself. Believe me, there are other things that come at the expense of it. My back definitely hurt more because I had to dig deep into my reservoirs. I'm holding a lot of things inside, and that's all true. But I will say that it was able to happen. And like that sense and what I want to take from this, I also, okay, I guess maybe I'm bragging on, public podcasting, but I want to say that the thing I think that got me to do that was a sense of personal responsibility of saying, only you can make this better right now. Nobody else. And when we talk about Talmidim, it's a Hamuni thing. It's a whole group of people. So it's kind of like, oh, all those people and they were so bad. But at the end of the day, it's each person who takes responsibility for their own behavior in different scenarios. And like that, I think, is what was able to happen. Like I had this acute sense that like I had to be responsible right now. And there wasn't anywhere to lean on at the moment. And I think that what was enabled me to make that kfitza. And I'm telling you seriously, like I felt like it was a little bit of like an early Sefirat Ha-omer. I'm serious, like mida opportunity. And so I just wanted to share that because to me, I think if I could analyze myself, I think it was that piece of like, I can't get lost in a crowd right now. And like sometimes when we're in a big crowd, we could feel that, oh, well, just, I could do this because someone else will do something else. But it was a very deep sense of like, this is a moment that like I have to step into. So I just was thinking about that when you shared that.
Yeah, it's also making me think about that we spoke so much about processes. Like sometimes you have to go through a process and you have to work up. And sometimes there's just these moments of clarity where, like, within a few seconds, you're just like, that's it. This has to end. My mother has this video that she loves of like someone at a therapist and they're pouring out their heart. And then the therapist is just like, stop it. And it's that loud. And he's like, just stop it. Just stop thinking like that. Stop being like that and stop. Okay, it's a generational like kind of sense of humor. But
maybe
it's
sometimes
like that. Sometimes it's like,
yes.
just stop it.
Yeah.
Just cut it out, Shayna. Like enough. Like that.
Or life doesn't allow you time to process, meaning so Sefirat Omer is a gift that we have 7 weeks.
Yeah.
Sometimes life says, show up now.
Yeah.
You don't have.
Or sometimes we could look at it as like, okay, I just need to stop it. And now I'm going to use this time as a way to like really internalize that.
Totally.
A way to really make it real. But
Yeah.
the switch could happen in a moment.
Yeah.
So thank
Totally.
you for bringing
and there's a lot of Torahs out there, by the way, about like right now. I think that's the first Tzidkat Tzaddik ever is in the book of Rav Tzadok. That's Pesach. Pesach is jumping in, right? And then you have the process to make something last. It's exactly how he opened the book.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the mourning.
Okay, so let's go back to these customs, which, as you said, are to commemorate this tragedy of Rabbi Akiva's students. And we have them recorded as early as the period of the Gaonim, which is going to be pre-Middle Ages, right? 8th, 9th century, etc. And we have already recorded that people wouldn't get engaged or married during this period as sort of, again, a respect to this big tragedy. But these customs expanded over time, and they expanded, as we know, to not listening to music and refraining from getting a haircut until like Ha-omer, when the deaths were said to have ceased. And so on the whole, these mourning customs apply equally to men and women, but there's a pretty important exception, and that's to do with haircutting. And so in general, first I'll say just as for men and women, Sephardim and Ashkenazim are a little bit different here. Sephardim wait until day 34, but Ashkenazim can already cut on day 33. And I'll also just say that common custom among Sephardi women is that they can actually cut their hair whenever they want during this time period. Also in mourning, in periods of mourning, there is not that same stringency of custom when it comes to Sephardic women. And I'll just say that the common custom among Ashkenazi women is not to get their hair cut. But even Rav Moshe Feinstein mentions that there is room for leniency if there's some like haircutting emergency. I exactly know what those haircutting emergencies look like, but I guess sometimes it gets overly out of control and people need an out.
I'll just throw out, we're not getting into any of this because there's so much material out there that people could look up or whatever, but we know there's also different customs in terms of which days to observe the mourning, because we say that they died over a period of 33 days.
Yeah.
But some people do that from the beginning of, the Pesach to Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day. Some people started only after Pesach, and there's definitely different practices out there.
Exactly. I'll also just add that a woman can remove any body hair that's not part of this custom of mourning, and definitely removing all kinds of hair or getting ready for mikvah. There's no question regarding that. And
even though for men that is a significant practice for them.
Exactly. And I guess I'll just say on a personal level, Shayna, to be really honest, I don't find that these customs have that much impact on my daily life, which is, we could say is a bad or good thing. But meaning I don't get my hair cut super often, and as a madrichat kalot, sometimes I welcome the break during this time period because it means that like I'm not rushing to teach anyone because no one's getting married right now. Sometimes it's actually a nice break from the wedding piece. And I will say that I do hear a lot from my husband. He hates having a beard, so this I hear a lot of complaining from him about the itchiness, etc. And I'll also just say, by the way, that also is very variant depending on how people have their customs about shaving on Rosh Chodesh or the shaving on Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is also a really big one. And, for someone going straight through, for a long time and depending on their beard growth, that could be very uncomfortable. But there's also variance in terms of the way we approach the other holidays in this period, which we'll come to in a minute.
Right. Do people shave every Friday for Shabbos? There's all different kinds of, so like there are people who shave because they're going to work and they need to shave. So
exactly. And the music piece also is a big range of opinion, like we mentioned in our 9 days episode also, is a big range of opinion about how stringent one, might need to be during
weddings, and then it went like live music, and then there's a lot of people that don't listen to any music. And I grew up in a house like that where we really didn't listen to, our originally tapes and then our CDs and then whatever, music is, even if it was recorded. And I'll say that like I try to still keep that up because I guess that is how I feel some, connection to these practices of mourning morning, I love music, as I spoke about when we did the episode on the 9 days. And for me, not listening to music is hard. And when I think about Sefirat Ha-omer, like that's what it is. It's like those few weeks after Pesach where we can't put on music in the car, or I can't have music on in my kitchen. And like that's how I feel it. So I try to keep that up, but there really is a very big range here. And I try to really on the one hand, like feel somewhat of that mourning because I do want to connect to this idea of like the loss of these Talmidim Rabbi Akiva and what that represents. And at the same time, we're balancing that with that joy and the anticipation that we don't want to be completely overshadowed. Like we still want to also be in that mindset. So it's a lot to like hold that together, with the excitement piece of it. And then in, the times that we live in, especially in the modern state of Israel, when we add in the other various days on the Israeli calendar that pop up in this time, then there's even more layers to hold and even more emotions to be balancing all the time, because we have these 2 days that come up not long after Pesach, which really also like emphasize the pain and the sadness or the mourning side of Jewish history. We have Yom HaShoah, which commemorates the Holocaust, and we have Yom HaZikaron, where we honor the loss of the soldiers that have been killed fighting on behalf of our state, as well as victims of terror. And like because those days like hit closer to home, like the Holocaust is still people's grandparents, their great grandparents. It feels very real for them. And of course, Yom HaZikaron, it's like there's not a family at this point in Israel that doesn't have some connection to, whether it's within their own family, unfortunately, or a friend or a neighbor, like someone that they really, really feel their loss very, very deeply. So you're holding all that. And then you're also holding the immense happiness of Yom HaTzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, and of Yom Yerushalayim, where we honor the reunification of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War in 1967, which are such powerful days. And it's just this feeling of like, intensity, like a lot of emotions, which I, on the one hand, like really, I appreciate intensity of emotion. Like there's something very powerful about living where you feel everything very, very deeply. And on the other hand, sometimes it's just too much. Sometimes it's just a lot. And certainly when we're trying to hold it all at once.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's just worth saying that sometimes, as you said, we can't hold it all. Like, and sometimes it's we can't tap into all that, or sometimes we need to opt out of something. We need to,
This one out.
yeah, opt out of that day. I mean, I think we all do that all the time, whether or not we like admit it to ourselves in that way. And I think that that's really okay. I would even just say, even without additional holidays or commemorations or things like that, on a daily basis, we're all holding multiple spaces at the same time, right? We function in different ways as a parent, as a child, as a sibling, as a friend, right? And as an employee, as an employer, like we're constantly holding different spaces within ourselves. And some of us are better at that kind of parallel living, and some of us maybe and don't even think about it like that. And it's just like we, gracefully move from each of those spaces to the next. And for some of us, those things are more difficult. And I think that it's really okay, especially in the years we've been in, which are so draining and so intense, that it's really okay to be like, this is something that I'm not able to hold right now. And in that way, I want to sort of recall you had quoted a name from Amital, but I actually know from somewhere else. But the idea of v'kov Hashem echalifu koach, this idea that we can tap into, if we don't have koach, then we can tap into somebody else's energy, right? If we are not able to bring that in. And to me, what's I think the biggest salvation almost of this time period, as we're saying, has so many layers to it, is the fact that when we come to these national days, whether it's the Yom HaShoah or Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, that sometimes we can be a spearheader of our own, programs in our own yishuvim, or our own communities, or our own shuls, or whatever. But sometimes we can also just be like, today this year I'm going to lean into what the community or what the nation is doing right now. And that's like, to me, something that's very powerful, definitely within Israel. And I think also outside of Israel, if it's in a shul setting, in a communal setting, I think that's the gift of living in a community, is being able to like
community will
tap
carry
into it. Yes,
Yeah, the community will carry it. And even if like on this particular year, I don't feel this emotion as much, or I'm not relating as much to this particular experience or this particular day, there's something on the national level.
Yeah, like a net,
Yeah,
that holds
that's
us.
really like holding us through it. I want to share that for me personally, I also have really found for a very long time at this point that looking to Rabbi Akiva and the attitude that he approached life with has helped give me a framework for being able to hold these different pieces, because I really, really connect to the personality of Rabbi Akiva, like to the point that our third son is named Akiva. And when people say, who's he named after? We're like, Rabbi Akiva. And they're like, no, for real. We're like, no, Rabbi Akiva. Like, we really, really, really appreciate his perspective and his world outlook, because what we see through a few different stories that are brought in the Gemara in his name is that he had this unmitigated, just positive approach that defines his life and defines his religious experience. So whenever he was confronted with something negative and with a difficult reality, he had this uncanny ability to be able to like kind of lift himself somewhat above the moment, a little bit like you were describing before, in that
Yeah.
moment as a mother, but like lift himself a little bit above the moment and see something bigger, like see the broader picture. More than once, the Gemara tells us that Hein Bochin v'Rabbi Akiva mitzachik, that his colleagues, the other rabbis, were crying, and they would find Rabbi Akiva laughing, and they would say, "What's going on? Like we're crying over the glory of the oppressive Roman Empire. Like how could it be that they're being glorified while we're suffering?" And Rabbi Akiva would focus on the fact, well, if that's the reward that's given to people who are so evil, like what must lay in store, for those who are righteous? Or the other rabbis were crying at the sight of a fox trotting on the destroyed Temple Mount. And Rabbi Akiva saw that and was already able to envision the future redemption and the fact that there would come a time when men and women, older, men and women, would stroll the streets of Yerushalayim in a rebuilt Jerusalem. And time again, they would turn to Rabbi Akiva and they would say, Akiva nechamtanu, not just like Akiva, your words are a source of comfort to us, but Akiva, you as a person, like the fact that there is someone out there who's able to kind of maintain hope, even when things are really discouraging, is something that is so necessary. Like it's so important to have people in our lives like that are able to kind of see above and are able to see beyond. And Rabbi Akiva was that person. Like he never lets kind of like the immediate thing that he sees before him hold him back. And we see this also in his own personal life, like how at 40 he started learning Torah and he wasn't put off by the fact that, maybe it's too late or maybe I can't do this. When a village is plundered and terrible things happen, he says, Kol ma'az avid rachmana l'tav avid. Whatever God does, it's for the best, not for the best in the sense of like, oh, wow, this feels amazing and I'm going to see right now how everything fits in and how the puzzle, all comes together. But no, a deep, deep, deep emunah that there's something bigger here, that's something beyond us. And I think maybe we see it at its most poignant when he loses all of his talmidim. Because you and I know as teachers, like, imagine that not just that you lost all your talmidim, but you lost all of your talmidim because they didn't treat each other with respect. When you are the person, Rabbi Akiva was the person who said, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, zeh klal gadol b'Torah." Like he was the person who really like understood that the most underlying principle that we have in the Torah is loving and respecting, each other. And now his talmidim were taking scrupulous notes and writing down everything that he says. They haven't managed to absorb and integrate the main thing that he stood for. So you would think if that wasn't enough to like turn someone off from teaching or make them feel like they're a total failure, like what would be? And we would expect Rabbi Akiva to close up shop after that or like to give up or to despair. And yet the Gemara goes out of its way to tell us that he chose 5 new Talmidim and he started over from scratch. And the Gemara even tells us that it's through those Talmidim that the Torah Sheba'al Peh that could have been lost because all of these Talmidim, were no longer with us and they were holding so much Torah. It's through those Talmidim that the Torah ended up like being able to survive and to be brought forward in this world. And it's because Rabbi Akiva, like, he didn't stop. And even at his own death, when he's taken out by the Romans and he is, combed with these hot iron combs, and he's one of the Asara Hamugid Malcha, one of the 10 rabbis that was brought out to be publicly executed, he doesn't see his death as a punishment. He doesn't look at himself as like, this victim. He doesn't even see his death as an atonement. He turns to his Talmidim and he says, Kriyat Shema. And they say, Rabbi Ad Khan, like, really? Like, even now you're going to be positive, even now? And he says, what do you mean? Like, my whole life, I wondered how I was going to fulfill V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha b'chol nafshecha, with all your soul, which he thought meant, until somebody wants to take your soul. I wonder, like, okay, not everyone has the opportunity to die al Kiddush Hashem. Not that we're looking for that, but he says, but now that it's come my way, I'm not going to kind of like see this moment as an exalted moment. And there's just something, I mean, I'm so far from that place of being able to be positive all the time, but I do try as much as I can to draw from that strength and be like, no, it is possible to hold different things together when you step back. Because, like, when you're up close, so like two very different things, you're like, but when you step back and you see them as part of something bigger, right? Like, you could have a Holocaust and you could somehow manage to move forward and, found a state. You could commemorate terrible, terrible losses of soldiers and terror victims, and come nightfall, all of a sudden switch into this celebratory Yom Ha'atzmaut mode, because you know how integrated the two are. And we can mourn the students of Rabbi Akiva, and we could observe like some of the practices that we were speaking about, and at the same time still understand that the time period that we're in is an opportunity kind of to develop ourselves and to connect to Torah. And I think that that I don't know, that perspective of Rabbi Akiva really, 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 it really helps me.
I think, though, when you describe Rabbi Akiva's personality, which I'm also just wondering out loud, but I want to say with a question mark, because I would have to compare the two Gemaras. I always wonder if the V'ahavta L'recha Kamocha, which he responds in a different setting, is what he learned from his student's death. Meaning, not that he said it and they all wrote the notes but didn't do it, but that he realized that that was really the most important thing. But I would have to look at the timeline of those two stories, and I want to be careful about that. But one thing I'll say about this idea of Rabbi Akiva is that Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Akiva, meaning the regular people are not right. We have leaders for that reason. A leader is somebody who can look at a moment and rise above that moment. I was just thinking that it doesn't matter what the situation was, but there was like someone put out like a particular episode, and it was like something that was like uplifting, and like these past 2 weeks that was very not. And I was thinking to myself, that's like the real mark of a leader, because like I don't know, most of us are just trying to like get air right now. And so, but the person who's able to, again, as you're saying, their Rabbi Akiva, it's like to lift them up out of that moment and to see bigger, and in his case to see, because I look at Rabbi Akiva, it's also he sees opportunity. It's like a positivity, but it's also seeing that this is an opportunity. I don't want to get too philosophical, I don't want to get too theodicy, is it a punishment, is it is it an atonement? But I just look at this as an opportunity for something else. And to me, that's really what often makes that big difference between, like, we need leaders. We need people who are able to do that, because most of us are not able to do that in many of these moments. And so that is really the uniqueness, and why we really need people who can hold us when we can't necessarily hold all those pieces together.
Yeah. And I think one of the things also, I think that really stands out for me in the Gemara about Rabbi Akiva when he sees the fox trotting on Har Habayit is he said to them, it's only once the nevuah about galut and the depths of the galut and the depths of the fact that like Yerushalayim will be like plowed under like a field, it's only once I see that really coming to fruition that I could really believe that the nevuot, the prophecies that we have about redemption, about geula, are also going to, one day be our lived experience. It's like he sees that one is kind of dependent on the other, or one is connected to the other. And if I come back to Sefirat Ha-omer, I think that's also something that resonates for me, that when we count from Pesach to Shavuot, what we're doing in essence is saying Shavuot doesn't stand alone, right? Because someone could come and say, Shavuot, Matan Torah, like that is what it's about. To be a Jewish person is to be makabel the Torah, to get the Torah and to, receive it. And like, why do we have to, like, meaning that day should be able to stand in a vacuum. That is, the core of our Judaism. And yet what the Torah is telling us is like, no, you can't just arrive at Shavuot without connecting it to Pesach, because unless you understand that we were slaves and that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim and that we had to go through a process and that he took us out of Mitzrayim, as you said, not just to be free people who could do whatever we want, but to become Avdei Hashem, right? It's not that, oh, we were slaves and now we're free and whatever. It's like we were Avdei Paro and he took us out so that we could become become Avdei Hashem. That's what gives Shavuot its meaning Shavuot isn't in a vacuum. If we forget kind of what we went through or the hard times that we experience, then we can't begin to experience the happiness or the awareness of how meaningful it is that Hashem took us out and he gave us the Torah, meaning that understanding enhances it. And it's the same thing here. Like if we would only celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut without having a deep appreciation of the sacrifice that went into it, then it wouldn't be the same celebration, And I think that's when when we try to hold things together, it's not because, oh, we have this and they're disconnected and we have to whatever. It's usually that they're very integrated, and the fact that there is pain makes us appreciate the the wonderful moments so much more, or the fact that people understand that we're sacrificing for something is what enables them to go through the pain. We have to find ways to kind of integrate
those
them.
pieces.
Yes, that's, I
Yeah.
think, what adds meaning to it. Anyway, what's your takeaway from all this? What do you think?
I guess I'll put myself in with the Amcha at the moment. I'm feeling that there's a lot going on. I'm coming into this time period pretty drained. I don't know exactly where I'll be, exactly when we count, start counting every single day. But I'm coming in, I think, like a lot of Am Yisrael, I could definitely speak for a lot of us in Israel, not coming in at my freshest moment of life. And I would also say that sometimes just because of my personal internal makeup, like the layering piece is hard for me because I'm like a very in the moment kind of person. And so sometimes it could be hard for me to be at sort of multiple places at the same time. In practicality, that means I'm not a good multitasker. And so I think I am coming into this time period looking to sort of lean into the strength of others. I've actually said that in a few conversations in the past few days. Like I've just needed some help with some projects I'm working on. I'm just like, I need ideas from other spaces. I need to lean into something else because we can't always be the spearheader of all that. We can't always be in that Rabbi Akiva space. So I'm going to put that honesty out here, and I'm assuming I'm not alone in it. And I'm definitely coming also with a tefillah that this time period will bring something that will feel more produced, that will feel like we put in efforts in something and the efforts come to pass. I think that there's just been a very strong sense that we've tried to jumpstart so many things, and a lot of it keeps getting kind of getting cut down, and definitely in Israel in the past while. So I'm definitely hoping that this time period brings a kind of renewal where it definitely exists in potential. And so I guess I'm coming in more with a tefillah, I think, to this time period. What about you, Shayna?
Beautiful. I'm also very much in need of the strength of others. And I think whether it's the strength of someone like Rabbi Akiva, where we have to kind of dig back into our sources and into figures from other times, or it's people in our modern day, who have that similar approach to Rabbi Akiva. I feel myself thirsty, for like anyone who is able to give somewhat of that broader perspective. And there's a man here in Israel named Yaakov Nitzan, who is the brother-in-law of one of our colleagues, of our friend Batsheva Samad, who teaches with us in Migdal Luz. And, he's like a regular guy who works in real estate and had a regular life. And then in the beginning of the war, a few months after October 7th, his son, Gilad, was tragically killed in Gaza. And he took that opportunity to found what is called Forum Hagvura, which is a forum that helps bereaved families and that gives a lot of attention to the soldiers that were lost, and the sacrifices that they made. And recently, another son of his got engaged to a beloved student of ours in Migdal Luz. And he went to his ex accounts and he wrote about how we as a nation don't forget our pain. It's not that they're not still in pain and that they don't think about their son every day, but that we also don't let that pain stop us from moving forward. And that it's a nation that is able to hold all its memories in one hand but on the other hand, is able to continue to move forward and build. That's a nation that ultimately is going to succeed. And for me, I'm just thinking a lot about Sefirat Ha-omer and about those ideas and about no matter what, we keep counting up, right? So, like, maybe today was a hard day, but tomorrow, actually, we just counted a higher number. Like, we keep moving forward. We always have something to move towards. There's always a way in which we could grow. There's always something that we could learn. There's always something that we could work on. There's a way in which we could connect to Hashem. There's a way in which we could ready ourselves more. So even if today was hard, or even if today wasn't that day, there's always tomorrow. So I think that ability to just keep counting, keep moving, keep holding both is something that I really appreciate, and that gives me a lot of strength. And I hope with all that, we could come to our own Kabbalat Torah yet again this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Shana. Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance. Make sure to check out the show notes for links on how this topic is discussed on Deracheha.org. Contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.